What if I told you James Bond initially was not meant to drive Aston Martins? That's because in 1953, when Ian Fleming, who my parents assure me is not a relation of mine, penned the original Casino Royale, he was actually meant to drive a Bentley 4.5 litre blower from the 1930s, which would have looked like this, which undoubtedly was a far cry from the Aston Martins 007 would be known for in later years. So for the first 3 James Bond novels, he actually drove that Bentley. But after that is when things changed. And this badge here would not actually feature in a James Bond novel until Goldfinger is released, when Q offers 007 either an Aston Martin DB3 or a Jaguar 3.4. Uncle Ian was a bit of a fan of what Aston Martin were up to at the time under the ownership of David Brown, the industrialist. Yes, the David Brown that made tractors. There's a bit of a trend there with sports car companies and tractors. And it's David Brown that gave these cars the DB name. And when it came time for James Bond to make it to the silver screen, in 1964, for Goldfinger, Sean Connery drove a DB5. And Aston Martin wasn't the first car he'd use on screen though. That title would go to the Series 2 Sunbeam Alpine that he'd use in Dr. No. For the second movie, From Russia with Love, he was given a Bentley Mark IV, essentially a successor to the original Bentley 4.5 litre that he would have driven in the original novels. Curiously enough, however, that car was retrofitted with a car phone, which is kind of odd when you consider the fact that the car was originally released in the mid-1930s. As mentioned, an Aston Martin would appear in front of James Bond for the first time in the Goldfinger novel, and the same was to be said for the movie version as well. However, rather than using the aging DB Mark III that he'd used in the novel version, he was presented with the brand new, only a couple months old at the time, DB5, a car that would become infamous and iconically linked with James Bond moving forward. Throughout the years, Bond frequently changed his mode of transport, and after the DB5, he was given a specially commissioned drop-top Toyota 2000 GT for the film You Only Live Twice. This car was specially made just for the movie due to the fact that Sean Connery famously didn't really fit into the coupe version, and the fact that the team wanted to use a characteristic Japanese sports car to match the Japanese setting. And as you can imagine, in the 1960s, there wasn't exactly a load of Japanese sports cars, especially large Japanese sports cars, on the market. In the 1970s, even the Americans got a look-in, with a Ford Mustang in Diamonds Are Forever, a Mercury Cougar on snow tyres and studs in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and an AMC Hornet in very Dukes of Hazzard-like scenes in The Man with the Golden Gun. But throughout all of that time, James Bond did go back to his roots a couple of times with a couple of British cars as well, including a couple of V8 Vantages and Aston Martin DBS of the time as well. And the car you're probably waiting for me to mention, that iconic underwater Lotus Esprit from The Spy Who Loved Me. The era that really fascinates me though is the 90s, when BMW saw the massive product placement potential. So in 1995, for GoldenEye, they gave him a Z3. They gave him a Z8 in The World Is Not Enough, and they also gave him the iconic BMW E38 750iL that 007 could famously drive via the phone he got from his other paid partnership, Sony Ericsson. It was only a matter of time, however, before Bond would inevitably end up back in something British, and that happened in the early 2000s with Die Another Day, where he returned to somewhat of his roots with an Aston Martin, namely a gorgeous V12 Vanquish. And that leads us to where we are today. Because for me, undoubtedly, 2 of the most iconic cars to appear in the James Bond franchise when it comes to the silver screen were the DB5 that Sean Connery drove, and this, the Aston Martin DBS that Daniel Craig drove. Without a shadow of a doubt, feels like the most James Bond car you can have. You expect it to have machine guns built in and all of that fun stuff, even though it never actually had that in the movie. Let me know what you think the most iconic James Bond car is in the comments, and also please don't follow or subscribe to Retro Garage if you don't like old school and classic car stories like this.